The 911 dispatcher's coffee mug shattered against the floor as she heard the caller's trembling voice. "There's a massive python wrapped around a bear cub by Cypress Creek, and it's been squeezing for hours." Dr. Margaret Sullivan jolted awake in her empty farmhouse, the emergency call piercing through the pre-dawn silence like a knife through her grief-numbed heart. This wasn't just another wildlife rescue. The python's coils were tightening with each labored breath the cub took. Neighbor Dorothy Henderson dropped her morning newspaper, rushing to her window as Maggie's pickup truck roared to life in the darkness. The elderly woman's hands trembled against the glass, remembering how Maggie had looked 5 years ago when they carried Harold's casket, that same desperate urgency now driving her toward another creature fighting for its life. "Dear Lord, not again," Maggie whispered, pressing harder on the accelerator. How much time did they have before it was too late? And why did saving this bear cub feel like her last chance to save herself? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie Sullivan had never imagined that at 68 her greatest battles would be fought not in research labs or academic conferences, but in the quiet corners of her own heart. 5 years ago, she had been Dr. Sullivan, respected wildlife biologist with 30 years at the University of Florida. Back then, her biggest concerns were grant applications and peer reviews. Now, she measured her days in the silence between Harold's phantom cough and the echo of Tommy's last phone call from Afghanistan. The farmhouse that once buzzed with Harold's woodworking projects and Tommy's weekend visits had become a museum of memories. Every morning, Maggie set 2 coffee cups out of habit, then quietly returned one to the cabinet. The breakfast table, once crowded with Harold's crossword puzzles and Tommy's military newsletters, now held only her pension statements and medical bills, $45,000 that haunted her mailbox like ghosts demanding payment. "Back in my day, we knew what loyalty looked like," she'd tell Harold's photograph each evening, straightening his frame on the mantelpiece next to Tommy's folded flag. The photo showed Harold at 65, his weathered hands holding a largemouth bass, grinning like a schoolboy. Tommy's military portrait captured him at 28, serious eyes that would never see 29. Her routine had become a careful choreography of avoiding reminders. She shopped during off hours to avoid the young mothers with their children. She drove past the hardware store where Harold used to spend Saturday mornings. She deleted voicemails from Dr. James Wheeler, her longtime colleague, because his cheerful check-ins only emphasized how thoroughly her world had shrunk. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson next door meant well with her casseroles and gossip, but even Dorothy's chatter about grandchildren felt like salt in wounds that refused to heal. "You need purpose again, Maggie," Dorothy would say, standing at the fence line with her coffee mug. "Harold wouldn't want you living like this." But purpose felt like a luxury when the electric company's final notices arrived with increasing frequency. Maggie's pension barely covered the mortgage, let alone Harold's lingering medical debt. She'd already sold Harold's workshop tools, Tommy's baseball card collection, even her mother's wedding ring. The house itself would be next. Some evenings, she'd sit in Harold's recliner, running calculations on the back of envelopes. The numbers never added up to hope. She'd developed a habit of talking to empty rooms, updating Harold on neighborhood news, asking Tommy's photo about the weather. The conversations felt real enough until her own voice echoed back, reminding her that she was just a grieving widow talking to herself. Dr. James Wheeler had been Harold's fishing buddy and Tommy's unofficial uncle. He still called monthly, offering lunch invitations she always declined. "You can't hide forever, Maggie," he'd say. "There's still life to be lived." But James didn't understand that some losses carved out spaces too large to fill with new experiences. Some silences were too profound for company to break. Until the morning, everything changed. The scene at Cypress Creek looked like something from a nightmare. 20 feet of Burmese python, thick as a telephone pole, had coiled around a black bear cub no bigger than a cocker spaniel. The massive serpent's muscular body created a living prison, each coil methodically tightening with the patience of a creature that had perfected killing over millions of years. The cub's small black eyes, wide with terror and exhaustion, locked onto Maggie's the moment she stepped from her truck. "Jesus Christ," whispered Ranger Marcus Thompson, a young man whose usual confidence had evaporated at the sight before them. "How long has this been going on?" "Caller said since before midnight," Maggie replied, her scientific mind automatically cataloging the scene even as her heart broke. "That's at least 6 hours. Python constriction doesn't kill by crushing bones, it stops circulation. Every time the prey exhales, the snake tightens. Eventually, the heart can't pump blood." A small crowd had gathered despite the early hour. Local volunteers, drawn by the emergency radio chatter, stood in respectful silence. Among them, she spotted Dr. James Wheeler's familiar gray beard. He'd driven 40 minutes from Gainesville after hearing her name on the emergency scanner. "Maggie," James approached with the careful tone he'd used since Harold's funeral. "You don't have to do this. Fish and Wildlife has trained professionals. Who won't be here for 3 hours?" She cut him off, kneeling beside the python's massive head. The snake's eyes were alert but not aggressive. Something felt wrong about the entire situation. The bear cub made a sound, part whimper, part moan, that reached into Maggie's chest and squeezed. It was the same sound Tommy had made as a baby during his ear infections, the helpless cry that had turned her into a fierce protector overnight 28 years ago. "We need to approach this systematically," Maggie announced, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the field. "Burmese pythons aren't native here. They don't typically hunt bear cubs. Something drove this snake to attack." Marcus pointed through the palmetto scrub. "Found the mother about 200 yards upstream. She's been dead at least 12 hours. Maggie's blood chilled. "Shot?" "Looks like it. Single bullet to the head. Clean kill." The picture became clearer and more horrifying. Poachers had killed the mother bear, probably for her gallbladder and paws, valuable in illegal wildlife markets. The cub, left to wander alone, had stumbled into the python's territory. What looked like predation was actually a tragedy compounded by human greed. "Poor baby," Dorothy Henderson had arrived with thermoses of coffee and her church voice. "All alone in the world, just like—" She caught herself before finishing the comparison that hung heavy in the humid air. The rescue required 8 painstaking hours. Working in teams, they applied gentle heat and moisture to relax the python's muscles. Maggie coordinated the effort with the precision of a surgeon, but her eyes never left the bear cub's face. Every few minutes, she'd speak to it in soothing tones. "Hold on, sweetheart. We're going to get you out of there." By noon, with temperatures climbing toward 90 degrees, exhaustion threatened everyone's focus. The python had loosened slightly, but the cub was growing weaker. Its breathing had become shallow, and those expressive dark eyes were beginning to glaze. "We're losing him," Marcus said what everyone was thinking. "No." Maggie's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. "We're not losing anybody else today." She made a decision that would haunt and transform her. Ignoring protocols and safety concerns, she reached directly for the cub's head, placing her bare hands against its fur while the python still maintained partial grip. The snake could have easily bitten her, but something in her calm demeanor seemed to communicate peaceful intentions. "Easy, baby. Easy." She found herself using the same voice she'd once used with Tommy during thunderstorms. "Mama's here now." The cub's reaction was immediate and startling. It stopped struggling, its breathing steadied, and those intelligent eyes focused on her face with what could only be described as recognition. Not recognition of her specifically, but recognition of safety, of maternal protection. "Well, I'll be damned," James murmured. "Look at that." The python, perhaps sensing the changed dynamic, began to loosen its coils. Within minutes, they were able to lift the bear cub free. It weighed maybe 15 pounds and was severely dehydrated, but alive. As Maggie cradled the cub against her chest, feeling its rapid heartbeat through her shirt, the crowd erupted in cheers, but she barely heard them. The cub had nestled against her neck, making soft, chittering sounds that vibrated against her collarbone. For the first time in 5 years, Maggie felt needed. "What happens now?" Dorothy asked, practical as always. "Fish and Wildlife will take custody," Marcus explained. "There's a facility in Ocala that handles orphaned cubs." "No." The word came out before Maggie had consciously decided to speak. Every eye turned to her. "I'll take him." "Maggie," James's voice carried warning, "you can't just adopt a wild bear. There are regulations, permits." "Then we'll get them." She looked down at the cub, who had begun to relax in her arms. "This baby has lost everything. He needs someone who understands what that feels like." Marcus frowned. "Mrs. Sullivan, with all due respect, caring for a bear cub is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. The liability alone—" "I raised a son," Maggie interrupted. "I think I can handle one small bear." "But your financial situation," James started, "will work itself out." She surprised herself with the conviction in her voice. "Sometimes the Lord gives us what we need, not what we want. And right now, we need each other." The cub stirred in her arms, opening his eyes to look directly at her face. In that moment, Maggie made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She'd name him Atlas, because sometimes the weight of the world came in unexpected packages, and sometimes carrying that weight was exactly what saved you. 3 days after the rescue, Atlas had made his decision clear. He would accept care from only one person. Every attempt by the veterinary staff to feed, examine, or even approach him resulted in plaintive cries that could be heard throughout the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. But the moment Maggie walked into the room, the cub would scramble to her side, pressing his small body against her legs with desperate relief. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Dr. Sarah Chen, the facility's lead veterinarian. "He's imprinted on you completely. Most cubs this age would bond with any consistent caregiver, but Atlas—" She gestured helplessly toward the cub, who was currently wrapped around Maggie's ankles like an oversized house cat. "He acts like you're his biological mother." The financial reality hit like a physical blow when Dr. Chen handed Maggie the care estimate. $500 per week for specialized formula, medical monitoring, and facility fees. Maggie's pension was $800 monthly. The mathematics of impossibility stared back at her from the invoice. "There might be other options," James Wheeler suggested that evening as they sat in Maggie's kitchen, Atlas sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bed beside her chair. "I've been making some calls. There are private facilities, wealthy collectors who specialize in exotic animals. They'd pay well for a hand-raised bear cub." Something cold settled in Maggie's stomach. "Collectors?" "Legitimate sanctuaries," James clarified quickly. "People with the resources to give Atlas the life he deserves. Think about it, Maggie. What can you really offer him? You can barely keep the lights on." The words stung because they carried truth. That morning's mail had brought another disconnection notice from the electric company. Her property taxes were 6 months overdue. The bank had started calling about mortgage payments. But as James spoke, Atlas stirred in his sleep, making the soft, chittering sounds that had become Maggie's favorite music. His tiny paws twitched as he dreamed, and occasionally he'd make nursing motions with his mouth. He was dreaming of comfort, of safety, of the maternal bond that had saved his life. "Those people don't love him," Maggie said quietly. They'd see him as a possession, not a child. He's not a child, Maggie. He's a wild animal. Tell him that. She reached down to stroke Atlas's fur, and even in sleep, the cub moved closer to her touch. Look at him, James. Really look. That's not the behavior of just any wild animal. That's trust. That's love. Young Ranger Marcus Thompson arrived the next morning with news that complicated everything. "I've been investigating the mother bear's death," he said, his usual easy demeanor replaced by grim seriousness. "It wasn't random poachers. This looks professional. Organized." Maggie poured him coffee while Atlas played with a rope toy at her feet, his recovery remarkable. "What do you mean, organized?" "The shot placement, the location choice, the timing. Someone knew that Bear's habits. Someone had been watching her." Marcus accepted the mug gratefully. "There's been a string of similar kills throughout North Florida. Always adult females with cubs. Always clean, professional executions. But why target mothers specifically?" "Because orphaned cubs are valuable," Marcus said grimly. "Easier to train, more docile in captivity. There's a black market for hand-raised bears among private collectors." The coffee mug slipped from Maggie's fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. Atlas immediately abandoned his toy to press against her legs, sensing her distress with the intuition that had marked their relationship from the beginning. "You think someone killed Atlas's mother specifically to take him?" "I think someone killed his mother planning to come back for him. The python attack was just bad luck that complicated their timeline." James, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly stood. "That's quite a conspiracy theory, Marcus. Don't you think you're being a bit paranoid?" "Am I?" Marcus pulled out his phone, showing them photographs. 3 other cubs have disappeared from wildlife sanctuaries in the past year. Facilities that were supposed to be legitimate. Facilities that paid handsomely for orphaned bears. The room fell silent except for Atlas's contented grunting as he explored under the kitchen table. Maggie watched him with new eyes, seeing not just the cub she'd rescued, but a target for people who viewed his innocence as commodity. "What are you suggesting?" she asked Marcus. "I'm suggesting that maybe Atlas is safer with someone who loves him than with someone who'd pay for him." Marcus glanced meaningfully at James. "I'm also suggesting we be very careful about who we trust with information about his whereabouts." James's face flushed red. "If you're implying that I'm not implying anything," Marcus cut him off. "I'm stating facts. Someone killed that mother bear planning to profit from her cub. That someone probably has connections in the wildlife trade. And that someone is still out there." Atlas chose that moment to waddle over to Maggie's chair, standing on his hind legs to paw at her knees, his signal that he wanted to be picked up. As she lifted him, feeling his solid weight against her chest, Maggie realized that saving Atlas had been the easy part. Keeping him safe would require resources, courage, and vigilance she wasn't sure she possessed. But looking into those trusting dark eyes, she knew she'd find a way. She had to. The first 2 weeks of Atlas's recovery transformed Maggie's empty farmhouse into something resembling a home again, where once silence had echoed through rooms filled only with memories. Now there was the constant shuffle of small paws, the gentle snoring of an adolescent bear, and the sound of Maggie's voice as she narrated their daily routines to her unlikely companion. "Now, Atlas, we're going to check your weight," she'd say each morning, coaxing the rapidly growing cub onto the bathroom scale she'd borrowed from Dorothy Henderson. 32 pounds this week. Harold would have said you're eating us out of house and home." The familiar pang of loss still came when she mentioned Harold's name, but it felt different now, softer, like remembering sunshine instead of mourning its absence. Atlas had developed routines that both charmed and broke her heart. Each morning, he'd patrol the house as if checking for threats, methodically visiting each room before returning to press his nose against her hand in what she'd come to recognize as his all-clear signal. When she sat in Harold's recliner to read, Atlas would position himself between her chair and the front door, a self-appointed guardian who took his duties seriously despite weighing less than a golden retriever. The financial strain, however, was becoming impossible to ignore. The veterinary bills alone consumed more than her monthly pension, and the specialized Bayer formula cost nearly $50 per container. Maggie found herself walking through the grocery store with a calculator, choosing between Atlas's needs and her own. She'd started skipping meals to ensure he had enough, telling herself that she needed to lose weight anyway. Dorothy Henderson noticed first, appearing at the kitchen door one morning with a casserole dish and the no-nonsense expression she'd perfected during 40 years of elementary school teaching. "Margaret Sullivan, you look like death warmed over. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" "I'm fine, Dot. Just tired from the night feedings." Maggie avoided her neighbor's penetrating gaze, focusing instead on preparing Atlas's morning bottle. The cub had learned to sit patiently during preparation time, but his eyes never left the bottle. "Fine, my foot. Your skin and bones, and that bear's the size of a washing machine. The math doesn't work, honey." Dorothy set the casserole down firmly. "The ladies at First Baptist have been talking. We want to help." The church fundraiser that weekend raised nearly $2,000, presented to Maggie in a coffee can decorated with construction paper bears that the Sunday school children had drawn. Maggie cried reading their notes, for the bear who found his mama, and God loves all his creatures. But even as she expressed gratitude, she knew it was a temporary solution to a permanent problem. James Wheeler's visits became more frequent during this period, and with them came increasingly elaborate solutions to Maggie's financial crisis. He'd arrive with brochures for wildlife sanctuaries that looked more like luxury resorts than conservation facilities, places with names like Wildwood Estates and Private Paradise Animal Preserve. "Look at this one in North Carolina," he'd say, spreading glossy photographs across her kitchen table while Atlas napped nearby. 200 acres, full veterinary staff, climate-controlled habitats. They specifically work with hand-raised bears. "How much do they pay?" Maggie asked, though something in her stomach clenched at the question. $50,000 for a healthy, socialized cub. More if he's particularly well-trained. James's enthusiasm was palpable. "Think about it, Maggie. That money would solve all your problems. You could keep the house, pay off Harold's medical bills, maybe even take a vacation." But as he spoke, Atlas stirred in his sleep, making the soft, grunting sounds that meant he was dreaming of nursing. His paws moved in slow, swimming motions, and occasionally his mouth would make suckling movements. Maggie knew he was dreaming of comfort, of the maternal bond that had become the center of his world. "He dreams of me," she said quietly. "What?" "Atlas. When he naps, he dreams of nursing. Watch his mouth." They sat in silence as the cub's sleeping form went through the motions of contentment. "He's not dreaming of 200 acres, James. He's dreaming of feeling safe with his mama." The breaking point came during Atlas's 3rd week of recovery. Maggie woke one morning to find the electricity had been shut off overnight. The refrigerator had stopped humming, and the specialized formula that had cost her last $50 was beginning to spoil in the warming compartment. Atlas sensed her distress immediately, pressing against her legs and making worried chittering sounds as she sat at the kitchen table with the final disconnection notice. She'd hidden the depth of their financial crisis from everyone, but sitting in the growing heat of a Florida morning with a hungry bear cub and no way to prepare his bottle, the weight of impossibility crushed down on her. "I don't know what to do, baby," she whispered to Atlas, who climbed into her lap despite his increasing size. "Mama doesn't know how to fix this." That afternoon, Marcus Thompson arrived unannounced, his usual casual demeanor replaced by urgent concern. "We need to talk," he said, glancing around the house. "And not here." Too exposed. They met at a small diner 20 miles outside town, Atlas riding in the passenger seat of Maggie's truck like he belonged there, his nose pressed to the window glass as he watched the world pass by. The cub had adapted to car travel with the resilience that characterized everything about him, turning each journey into an adventure rather than a trauma. "I've been investigating the bear killings," Marcus said once they were settled in a corner booth. Atlas curled up at Maggie's feet under the table. "It's bigger than I thought. We're looking at an organized wildlife trafficking operation that spans multiple states." Maggie's coffee grew cold as Marcus laid out the evidence. Professional hunters targeting specific animals, fake sanctuaries that existed only on paper, wealthy collectors willing to pay premium prices for exotic pets. The scope was staggering. The cruelty systematic. "The mother bears aren't random targets," Marcus continued. "They're selected based on the market value of their cubs, young, healthy females with first or second litters. Atlas's mother was perfect for their purposes. But they didn't get him. No, thanks to that python and your rescue efforts. But here's what worries me. They know he exists. They know he survived. And they know he's worth a lot of money to the right buyer." The waitress refilled their coffee cups, cooing over the beautiful dog sleeping under their table. Maggie didn't correct her, understanding instinctively that Atlas's true identity needed protection. "What are you saying?" she asked Marcus. "I'm saying be very careful who you trust. This organization has connections everywhere. Legitimate wildlife facilities, government agencies, even law enforcement. They've managed to operate for years because they look respectable on the surface." That evening, James arrived with another stack of sanctuary brochures and an unexpected companion, a well-dressed man in his 50s who introduced himself as Dr. Richard Hawthorne from the Southeast Wildlife Conservation Foundation. "Mrs. Sullivan." Dr. Hawthorne's voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Dr. Wheeler has told me about your remarkable bear. I'd very much like to see him." Something in his tone made Atlas uneasy. The cub, who had been playing contentedly with his rope toy, moved closer to Maggie's chair, positioning himself between her and the strangers. His behavior was subtle but unmistakable, protective, wary, alert. "Atlas isn't performing tricks," Maggie said carefully. "He's a wild animal, not an entertainment." Of course. Dr. Hawthorne's smile felt calculated. "But from what James tells me, he's remarkably well socialized. That's exactly what our program needs. A bear who can serve as an ambassador for his species, help us educate the public about conservation." As they talked, Maggie found herself studying the man's expensive shoes, his perfectly groomed appearance, the way his eyes kept assessing Atlas like he was calculating value rather than appreciating a living creature. When Dr. Hawthorne reached toward Atlas, offering his hand for the cub to sniff, Atlas backed away with a low grunt of distrust. "He's usually so friendly," James said, sounding genuinely puzzled. But Maggie wasn't puzzled at all. She'd learned to trust Atlas's instincts, and right now every signal he was sending screamed danger. Bears, she remembered from her research years, had an exceptional sense of smell and could detect human emotions through pheromones. Atlas wasn't just being antisocial. He was identifying a threat. "I think that's enough for tonight," she said, standing. "Atlas gets cranky when he's overstimulated." After they left, Maggie sat in her darkened living room, the electricity still wasn't restored, holding Atlas as he trembled against her chest. Outside, she could hear the sound of car engines, but the vehicles didn't drive away immediately. They sat in her driveway for nearly 10 minutes before finally departing. "What did you sense, baby?" she whispered into his fur. "What did you smell on that man that I couldn't see?" Atlas responded by burrowing deeper into her embrace, his small body radiating the kind of distress she'd only seen after his rescue from the python. For a creature who had faced death and emerged trusting, this level of fear meant something significant. As the night deepened around them, Maggie made a decision that would define everything that followed. Whatever was happening, whatever larger forces were moving around them, she would trust Atlas's instincts over human reassurances. The cub, who had survived abandonment, predation, and trauma, had earned that faith. She just hoped they both had the strength for whatever was coming next. The confrontation erupted on a humid Thursday evening, exactly 6 weeks after Atlas's rescue. Maggie had spent the afternoon teaching the now 40-pound cub how to fish in the shallow creek behind her property, watching with maternal pride as his natural instincts emerged through patient play. Atlas had successfully caught his first small bluegill, though he'd been more interested in batting at it than eating it, and Maggie found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time since Harold's death. The sound of multiple vehicles pulling into her driveway shattered that moment of peace. Through the kitchen window she watched a convoy that made her blood run cold. James's familiar sedan, Dr. Hawthorne's black SUV, and behind them, a large white van with Southeast Wildlife Transport emblazoned on its side. Atlas immediately pressed against her legs, his body rigid with the same tension she'd observed during Dr. Hawthorne's previous visit. "It's time, Maggie," James announced as he entered her kitchen without invitation, his usual warm demeanor replaced by businesslike efficiency. "We've finalized the arrangements with Dr. Hawthorne's facility. Atlas will have everything he needs: professional care, proper socialization with other bears, space to express his natural behaviors." Dr. Hawthorne followed, accompanied by 2 men in wildlife control uniforms, who immediately began assessing Atlas with the detached professionalism of people accustomed to handling valuable cargo. "The paperwork is all in order," he said, producing an official-looking folder. "Emergency relocation for the animal's welfare. Mrs. Sullivan, you've done admirably under difficult circumstances, but this situation has progressed beyond what any private individual can handle." "No." The word came out stronger than Maggie had intended, surprising even herself. Atlas seemed to sense her defiance and positioned himself more firmly between her and the strangers. "He's not going anywhere." "Maggie, be reasonable." James's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child. "Look at him. He's nearly 50 pounds and growing fast. In 6 months he'll be too large for you to handle safely. In a year he could seriously injure you without meaning to." One of the wildlife officers stepped forward, his hand resting casually on a tranquilizer gun. "Ma'am, we understand this is emotional, but we have legal authority to remove any wild animal deemed a public safety risk. The bear comes with us tonight one way or another." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, crowded with hostile intentions that Atlas could sense as clearly as she could. The cub had begun to pace in small circles, a stress behavior she'd never seen from him before. His usual calm confidence was replaced by the kind of agitation that preceded fight-or-flight responses. "Public safety risk?" Maggie's voice rose with indignation. "He's a baby who plays with rope toys and falls asleep during bedtime stories. The only risk here is from people who see dollar signs when they look at him." Dr. Hawthorne's mask slipped slightly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you've formed an attachment, but—" "An attachment?" The words exploded from her with 5 years of suppressed grief and newfound purpose. "This isn't an attachment. This is love. This is family. This is what happens when 2 broken souls find each other and decide to heal together." The wildlife officers exchanged glances, and she could see them calculating the best approach for subduing both her and Atlas with minimal scene. But as they positioned themselves strategically around the kitchen, Atlas made a decision that changed everything. The cub, who had been pressed against her legs, suddenly reared up on his hind legs and wrapped his front paws around her waist in what could only be described as a protective embrace. It was a behavior she'd never taught him, something that came from pure instinct or pure love. The 40-pound bear cub was trying to shield his human mother from perceived threats. "Jesus," one of the officers whispered. "I've never seen anything like that." Even Dr. Hawthorne looked momentarily stunned by the display of devotion. But James, she noticed, was checking his watch with barely concealed impatience. "How much are they paying you, James?" The question came out before she'd consciously formed it, but once spoken, it hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be retracted. "Maggie, what are you talking about? How much is Atlas worth to these people?" "Because suddenly you're very interested in his welfare and very interested in my inability to provide for him." She looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. James's guilt, Dr. Hawthorne's calculation, the officer's discomfort. Marcus was right, wasn't he? About the trafficking operation, about people who target mother bears to harvest their cubs. The silence stretched long enough to confirm her suspicions. James's shoulders sagged with the weight of discovered deception, but Dr. Hawthorne straightened with the confident bearing of someone whose cover had been blown, but who still held all the cards. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're becoming hysterical. Perhaps it would be better if we sedated you both and completed this transfer with less drama." He nodded to the officers, who began approaching with their tranquilizer equipment. That's when Atlas acted with the intelligence that had characterized him from their first meeting. Instead of becoming more agitated, he suddenly went completely calm, pressing himself against Maggie's legs and making soft, chittering sounds that she'd learned meant he wanted her attention. When she looked down, he was staring pointedly toward the back door, the same door they'd used for their fishing expedition that afternoon. "Run," she whispered, understanding immediately. They moved as one organism, Maggie grabbing her truck keys from the counter, while Atlas positioned himself to block the officer's pursuit route. For a 40-pound bear cub, he proved remarkably effective at creating chaos, knocking over chairs and generally making himself a difficult target for tranquilizer darts in the confined space. Maggie burst through the back door with Atlas close behind, both of them sprinting toward her ancient pickup truck with the desperate energy of prey animals fleeing predators. Behind them, she could hear James shouting, "Don't hurt her! Don't hurt either of them!" The truck started on the second try, a miracle given its usual temperamental behavior. Atlas leaped into the passenger seat with athletic grace, immediately pressing his nose to the window as if he understood they were escaping danger. As they pulled out of the driveway, Maggie caught a glimpse of Dr. Hawthorne speaking urgently into a cell phone while the wildlife officers ran toward their van. "Where do we go, baby?" she asked Atlas as they sped down the county road. "Where can we hide until we figure this out?" As if in answer to her question, her phone rang. Marcus Thompson's name appeared on the screen and she answered with shaking hands. "Maggie, where are you? I just got a call about wildlife officers at your house." "We ran. Atlas and I, we had to run. James was working with them, Marcus. The trafficking ring you warned me about." "I know. I've been gathering evidence, but I needed more time." "Are you safe right now?" She looked at Atlas, who had positioned himself so he could see both the road ahead and the mirrors behind them, alert for pursuit, but calm in her presence. "We're safe for now, but they have legal paperwork, tranquilizer guns. They're not giving up. Meet me at the old fishing camp on Lake Henderson. You know the one, where Harold used to take Tommy. I'll explain everything when you get there. And Maggie, whatever you do, don't trust anyone else. This goes higher than we thought." As she hung up the phone and adjusted her course toward the lake, Maggie felt the weight of impossible choices settling around her like a closing net. Behind them, she could see headlights in the gathering dusk, vehicles that seemed to be maintaining their distance but not falling behind. Atlas reached across the seat to place one paw on her arm, a gesture of comfort that nearly broke her heart. Here was this innocent creature trusting her to protect him from a world that saw him only as valuable merchandise, and she was driving toward an uncertain confrontation with forces she didn't fully understand. "I won't let them take you," she promised him as the lake came into view through the trees. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs me, I won't let them turn you into a commodity." Atlas made a soft sound that might have been agreement or might have been forgiveness for all the ways the adult world had failed him. Either way, it strengthened her resolve for the battle she knew was coming. The heart attack struck Maggie at 3:17 a.m. on a moonless night, 48 hours after their escape to the fishing camp. She woke to crushing chest pain that radiated down her left arm like liquid fire. Her body's rebellion against weeks of stress, poor nutrition, and the constant adrenaline of protecting Atlas from forces beyond her control. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was Atlas's concerned face hovering over her, his dark eyes wide with the kind of distress she'd only seen when he'd been trapped by the python. When the ambulance arrived, summoned by Marcus Thompson, who'd found them both after Maggie failed to answer her phone that morning, Atlas refused to let the paramedics near her. The 45-pound bear cub positioned himself over her unconscious form like a living shield, making distressed vocalizations that the EMTs later described as the most heartbreaking sound I've ever heard from an animal. "We can't sedate him," the lead paramedic told Marcus grimly, "not without knowing his medical history. But we can't treat her with him guarding her like this." Marcus made a decision that would haunt him. "Atlas," he said firmly, using the commanding tone Maggie employed during training sessions. "Move. Let them help Mama." The cub looked at him with an expression of such profound betrayal that Marcus felt it physically. But slowly, reluctantly, Atlas stepped aside, though he remained close enough to touch Maggie's outstretched hand with his nose. At Alachua General Hospital, the diagnosis was severe stress cardiomyopathy, literally a broken heart. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the attending cardiologist, had seen it before in elderly patients who'd suffered profound loss or trauma. "Her heart muscle is severely weakened," she explained to Marcus in the hallway outside the ICU. "The emotional stress of recent events has essentially stunned her cardiac function. She may not survive the night." But the immediate medical crisis was only the beginning of their nightmare. Word of Maggie's hospitalization spread quickly through the small community, and with it came the vultures. Dr. Hawthorne appeared at the hospital within hours, accompanied by a team of lawyers and social workers, all armed with legal documents declaring Atlas a public health hazard in need of immediate professional care. "The animal cannot remain with an incapacitated owner," Hawthorne announced to the gathered medical staff with the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "We have emergency custody orders and the facilities to provide proper care." Atlas, who had been allowed into Maggie's room by compassionate nurses who couldn't bear to separate them, seemed to understand that the humans arguing in the hallway were deciding his fate. He pressed himself against Maggie's hospital bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip, and laid his head on her chest as if listening to her labored heartbeat. The sight broke something in Dorothy Henderson, who had rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard the news. "That bear is the only thing keeping her alive," she declared to anyone who would listen. "You separate them now, you'll kill them both." But legal authority trumped emotional appeals. The wildlife officers, the same ones who had tried to capture Atlas at Maggie's home, arrived with tranquilizer equipment and a transport cage. As they prepared to sedate the cub, something remarkable happened. Atlas began to sing. It started as a low humming sound, almost subsonic, the kind of vocalization mother bears use to comfort distressed cubs. But as the officers approached, the sound grew more complex, more desperate, a keening lament that seemed to echo through the hospital corridors like a funeral dirge. Nurses stopped their rounds to listen, Doctors paused mid-conversation. Even the hardened wildlife officers hesitated, tranquilizer guns lowered. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of them. "He's mourning. He thinks she's dying." The sound seemed to reach Maggie even in her unconscious state. Her heart rate, which had been erratic on the monitors, began to stabilize. Her breathing deepened. For the first time in 18 hours, her vital signs showed improvement. Dr. Martinez, who had been monitoring from the nurses' station, made an unprecedented decision. "Nobody touches that bear," she announced with the authority that came from 30 years of cardiac care. "He's providing therapy that our machines can't replicate." But Dr. Hawthorne had resources beyond local medical opinion. Within 6 hours, he returned with federal wildlife officials and a court order signed by a judge who lived 3 counties away. A judge who, Marcus would later discover, had received substantial campaign contributions from shell companies connected to the wildlife trafficking operation. The sedation was swift and professional. Atlas, exhausted from his vigil over Maggie, couldn't fight off the effects of the tranquilizer dart. As consciousness faded, he reached one paw toward Maggie's hand, a final gesture of connection before collapsing into chemical sleep. The removal was conducted with clinical efficiency. Atlas was loaded into a transport crate while still unconscious, loaded into the white van, and driven away from the only family he'd ever known. The last thing the bear cub saw as the tranquilizer wore off was the hospital growing smaller through the van's rear window. Maggie's condition deteriorated immediately. Without Atlas's comforting presence, her heart rhythm became chaotic again. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low. The monitors that had shown steady improvement began painting a picture of a woman whose will to live was evaporating with each passing hour. "Where is he?" were her first words when she regained consciousness 36 hours later, her voice barely a whisper through the oxygen mask. Dorothy, who had maintained a constant vigil beside the hospital bed, couldn't meet her eyes. "Honey, you need to focus on getting better." "Where is Atlas?" The question came out with more strength, the fierce maternal instinct overriding physical weakness. "They took him to a facility, a place where he'll be safe." "What facility? Where?" Dorothy's silence was answer enough. They didn't know where Atlas had been taken. Dr. Hawthorne's Southeast Wildlife Conservation Foundation had provided no address, no contact information beyond a disconnected phone number. Atlas had vanished into a system designed to make such disappearances untraceable. The next week became a descent into despair that no medical intervention could address. Maggie refused to eat, barely responded to visitors, and spent her conscious hours staring at the ceiling with the hollow expression of someone whose reason for living had been surgically removed. The medical team tried everything: antidepressants, therapy, even bringing in a hospital chaplain, but nothing could reach the fundamental emptiness that Atlas's absence had created. Marcus Thompson worked frantically to trace the bear's location, calling every wildlife facility in 3 states, following paper trails that led to dead ends, pursuing leads that evaporated under scrutiny. The trafficking operation had been more sophisticated than he'd imagined, with layers of legitimate-seeming organizations masking the underlying criminal enterprise. "It's like he just disappeared," Marcus told Dorothy during one of his evening visits to Maggie's bedside. "No facility has any record of receiving him, no transport company has logs of delivery. It's as if Atlas never existed." But Atlas did exist, somewhere in a nightmare that Maggie's imagination created in the absence of facts. She pictured him caged, confused, crying for a mother who would never come. She imagined him gradually losing hope, the bright intelligence in his eyes dimming as he realized that the bond he'd trusted had been broken not by his choice, but by forces beyond his understanding. On the seventh day after Atlas's removal, Maggie's heart stopped beating for 43 seconds. The medical team managed to resuscitate her, but Dr. Martinez delivered a grim prognosis to the small group gathered in the waiting room. "She's given up," the cardiologist said simply. "Her body is shutting down because her spirit has quit fighting. Without some reason to live, some hope to hold on to, I don't think we can save her." That night, as Maggie lay in the ICU connected to machines that were keeping her alive against her will, a storm rolled across North Florida. Thunder shook the hospital windows, and lightning illuminated the rain-swept parking lot where Dorothy Henderson sat in her car, crying for the first time since her own husband's death 20 years earlier. Inside room 314, Maggie dreamed of a small black bear cub learning to fish in a shallow creek, his paws batting playfully at minnows while his adopted mother watched with pride and love. In her dream, Atlas was free, happy, and safe. In her dream, love had been enough to protect him from a world that measured worth in dollars rather than devotion. She woke knowing it had only been a dream, and the knowledge nearly stopped her heart again. The truth began unraveling at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday when James Wheeler's conscience finally cracked under the weight of what he'd helped orchestrate. He appeared in Marcus Thompson's living room, disheveled and reeking of whiskey, clutching a manila folder that would expose the full scope of the trafficking operation that had stolen Atlas and destroyed Maggie's will to live. "I can't sleep," James confessed, his hands shaking as he spread documents across Marcus's kitchen table. "Every night I hear her voice asking where he is, and I know I'm the reason she doesn't have an answer." The paperwork revealed a criminal enterprise more sophisticated and cruel than Marcus had imagined. The Southeast Wildlife Conservation Foundation was a front organization with connections reaching into federal agencies, legitimate zoos, and private collections across the country. Dr. Richard Hawthorne wasn't just a wildlife trafficker. He was the coordinator of an international network that had moved hundreds of exotic animals over the past decade, generating millions in profit from creatures torn from their natural habitats, or, in Atlas's case, from the only family they'd ever known. "Atlas isn't at any wildlife sanctuary," James whispered, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. "He's being held at a private facility in Georgia, being trained for sale to a collector in Dubai. The buyer specializes in exotic pets for wealthy clients who want animals that are completely docile around humans." Marcus felt his stomach turn. "You mean they're breaking his spirit, turning him into a living toy?" "The training process takes 6 months. They use isolation, food deprivation, and controlled fear to make the animals completely dependent on human approval. By the time they're finished, the bear will perform tricks, pose for photographs, and never show aggression even when mistreated." James's voice broke. "They're erasing everything that made Atlas special: his intelligence, his independence, his capacity for genuine affection." The most damning document in the folder was a psychological profile that Dr. Hawthorne had commissioned on Maggie herself. It detailed her financial vulnerability, her emotional isolation after losing Harold and Tommy, and her psychological need to nurture something helpless. The report concluded that she would be the perfect mark for a long-term extraction scheme, someone who would form such a strong bond with a rescued animal that she'd be unable to make rational decisions about its welfare. They planned this, Marcus realized with growing horror. From the beginning, they planned to let her fall in love with Atlas and then use that love to manipulate her. The mother bear's killing wasn't random either. They'd been tracking her for months, waiting for the right moment when her cub would be old enough to survive separation, but young enough to imprint on a human caregiver. The python attack was just lucky timing. It gave them a rescue scenario that would make Maggie look like a hero while setting up the eventual welfare concern that justified Atlas's removal. Marcus stared at the psychological profile. seeing Maggie's deepest vulnerabilities laid out like a medical chart. Her grief over Tommy, her guilt about Harold's medical expenses, her desperate need to feel useful again, all of it catalogued and weaponized by people who saw human emotion as just another tool for profit. "There's more," James continued, pulling out a series of photographs that made Marcus's blood freeze. They showed Atlas in a concrete enclosure barely large enough for him to stand and turn around. The bear cub, who had once played freely in creek water and fallen asleep in Maggie's lap, was now confined to a space that looked more like a prison cell than an animal habitat. But it was Atlas's expression in the photographs that broke Marcus's heart completely. The intelligent curiosity that had characterized him was gone, replaced by the vacant stare of a creature whose spirit was being systematically destroyed. His eyes, once bright with mischief and affection, now held the hollow look of an animal that had given up hope. "How long has he been there?" Marcus asked. 3 weeks. They estimate another 3 months before he's fully trained for export." James pulled out one final document, a sales contract with a Dubai collector who specialized in what the paperwork euphemistically called interactive wildlife experiences for private entertainment. Marcus was already reaching for his phone when James grabbed his wrist. "You can't just call the police." "Hawthorne has connections throughout law enforcement. Half the judges in North Florida owe their elections to his political contributions. If you move too fast, Atlas disappears completely, and Maggie dies not knowing what happened to him. Then what do you suggest? We get him back ourselves, tonight, before they can move him to another location." The rescue mission began at sunset with Marcus, James, and an unlikely ally, Dorothy Henderson, who had arrived at the planning meeting with a determination that reminded everyone why she'd been able to control rowdy third graders for 4 decades. "That bear is family," she declared, adjusting her reading glasses to study the facility blueprints James had provided. "And when family's in trouble, you don't wait for paperwork. You act." The Georgia facility sat on 200 acres of pine forest, surrounded by electric fencing and monitored by security cameras. It masqueraded as a legitimate animal rehabilitation center, complete with educational programs and volunteer opportunities that provided cover for its illegal activities. The irony was perfect. People donated money and time to what they believed was wildlife conservation, unknowingly supporting the very industry that was destroying the animals they wanted to protect. Atlas was housed in Building C, a concrete structure that held difficult cases requiring intensive behavioral modification. The building was climate-controlled, soundproofed, and designed to break the spirits of animals whose natural behaviors conflicted with their intended roles as human entertainment. They cut through the perimeter fence at 11 p.m., Marcus using bolt cutters while Dorothy served as lookout, and James disabled the security cameras with techniques he'd learned during his brief military service decades earlier. The facility was minimally staffed at night. Just 2 security guards who spent most of their shift playing cards in the main office. Finding Atlas required searching through dozens of concrete cells, each containing an animal in various stages of psychological breakdown. Marcus saw tigers pacing obsessively, primates huddled in corners, exotic birds that had plucked themselves bald from stress. The facility was a catalog of human cruelty disguised as conservation. Atlas was in cell 23, curled into a tight ball in the corner furthest from the door. He'd lost weight during his 3 weeks of captivity, his once glossy coat now dull and matted. When Marcus whispered his name, the bear didn't initially respond. It was only when James called out, "Atlas, where's Mama?" in a perfect imitation of Maggie's voice that the cub lifted his head. The recognition was immediate and heartbreaking. Atlas struggled to his feet, swaying from weakness, and stumbled toward the cell door with the desperate energy of someone who had given up hope and suddenly found it again. But when he reached the bars and saw that Maggie wasn't there, his collapse was complete. He sat down heavily and began to make the same keening sound they'd heard at the hospital, the sound of a creature mourning something precious that had been lost. "We're going to take you home," Marcus promised, working frantically to pick the lock on the cell door. "We're going to take you back to Mama." The word Mama seemed to energize Atlas in ways that food or comfort couldn't. He pressed against the cell door, making soft, chittering sounds that Marcus recognized as the vocalizations he'd used with Maggie during their happiest moments together. Even after 3 weeks of systematic abuse, the bond remained intact. Getting Atlas out of the facility proved easier than expected. The bear cub seemed to understand that this was a rescue rather than another transfer to confinement. He stayed close to his human companions, moving quietly through the shadows, pausing when they paused, following their lead with the intelligence that had first impressed Maggie during his rescue from the python. It wasn't until they were safely back in Marcus's truck, Atlas curled up in the passenger seat, making contented sounds for the first time in weeks, that the full magnitude of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. "We just committed about 15 felonies," James observed from the back seat. "Good," Dorothy replied firmly. "Some laws deserve to be broken when they protect monsters instead of innocents." But their celebration was premature. As they drove through the Georgia night toward Florida, Marcus's phone rang with news that changed everything. Dr. Martinez at Alachua General, her voice tight with professional concern. "You need to get here now. Maggie's condition has deteriorated severely. We're not sure she'll make it through the night." Atlas, as if sensing the urgency in Marcus's voice, sat up straighter in the passenger seat and fixed his gaze on the road ahead. After 3 weeks of captivity and systematic abuse, he was finally going home. The question was whether his mama would still be there when he arrived. The reunion happened at 4:23 a.m. in the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit of Alachua General Hospital, in defiance of every medical protocol and visiting regulation the facility had ever established. Atlas, still weak from his ordeal, but alert with desperate hope, was smuggled through service corridors and freight elevators by a conspiracy of nurses who had watched Maggie's condition deteriorate for 3 weeks and understood that sometimes medicine required miracles that couldn't be prescribed. Dr. Martinez made the decision that saved 2 lives when she opened the door to room 314 and witnessed what she would later describe as the most profound therapeutic intervention I've ever seen. Atlas, the moment he saw Maggie's still form connected to monitors and breathing apparatus, made a sound that was part sob, part song. The vocalization of a creature who had feared his most important person was lost forever. Maggie's eyes opened for the first time in 18 hours. Her heart rate, which had been dangerously irregular, immediately stabilized. The monitors that had been painting pictures of organ failure began showing signs of recovery that the medical team couldn't explain through conventional understanding of cardiac rehabilitation. "Atlas?" The word came out as barely a whisper through her oxygen mask, but it carried 5 years of accumulated love for Harold, for Tommy, and for this bear cub who had taught her that family could be found in the most unexpected forms. The bear cub, despite his own weakness from weeks of abuse and malnutrition, climbed carefully onto the hospital bed and positioned himself along Maggie's side, his head resting on her chest directly over her heart. For the first time since his removal from her care, Atlas's body relaxed completely. His breathing synchronized with hers. His presence seemed to regulate not just her heartbeat, but her entire biological system's will to continue functioning. "I thought I'd lost you forever," Maggie whispered, her hand finding its familiar place in his fur. Atlas responded by making the soft, chittering sounds that had become their private language, sounds that meant safety, home, unconditional love. Dr. Martinez watched the monitors in amazement as Maggie's vital signs improved more dramatically in 10 minutes than they had in the previous 3 weeks. "I don't understand what I'm seeing medically," she told the gathering crowd of medical staff who had come to witness the reunion, "but I understand what I'm seeing humanly. This is love healing what medicine couldn't reach." The celebration was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hawthorne and a team of federal marshals armed with court orders and accompanied by 2 armed wildlife officers carrying tranquilizer guns. Hawthorne's face was flushed with rage at having his carefully orchestrated theft exposed, but his voice maintained the professional calm of someone accustomed to using legal authority to cover criminal activity. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're harboring stolen federal property," he announced to the room full of medical staff and family friends. "That animal was legally removed from your custody and is now the subject of a federal investigation. These officers have authority to sedate and remove it immediately." But something had changed in the 3 weeks since Atlas's original capture. The hospital staff, who had watched Maggie nearly die from grief, formed a protective barrier around her bed. Dorothy Henderson positioned herself between the wildlife officers and Atlas, her 72-year-old frame radiating the authority of someone who had spent decades protecting children from bullies. "You'll have to go through me first," she declared, and her words were echoed by a chorus of nurses, orderlies, and even other patients who had gathered in the hallway after word of the reunion spread through the hospital. Marcus Thompson chose that moment to arrive with his folder of evidence, accompanied by Agent Sarah Collins from the FBI's Wildlife Trafficking Task Force, who had been investigating Hawthorne's operation for 6 months without knowing that Atlas was one of their victims. "Dr. Richard Hawthorne," Agent Collins announced with the satisfaction of someone who had finally gathered enough evidence to act, "you're under arrest for violation of the Lacey Act, conspiracy to commit wildlife trafficking, fraud, and about 15 other federal charges that we'll discuss in detail downtown." The next few minutes were chaos, as Hawthorne protested his innocence. The federal marshals realized they'd been manipulated into serving papers for a criminal operation, and the wildlife officers discovered that their tranquilizer guns were being used to support illegal activity rather than legitimate conservation. But through it all, Atlas remained calm and still on Maggie's hospital bed, as if he understood that the humans arguing around him were finally sorting out the forces that had tried to separate him from his family. His breathing remained synchronized with Maggie's, his presence continuing to provide the therapy that was healing her broken heart. James Wheeler, who had been standing quietly in the corner throughout the confrontation, finally stepped forward with his own confession. "Agent Collins, I have documentation of the entire operation, including financial records showing payments to state officials, veterinarians, and wildlife officers who facilitated illegal captures and transfers." The evidence was overwhelming. Within 2 hours, the criminal network that had operated for over a decade was collapsing as participants scrambled to cooperate with federal investigators rather than face decades in prison. The Southeast Wildlife Conservation Foundation was exposed as a shell organization. The Georgia facility was raided with dozens of illegally held animals rescued and their captors arrested. Dr. Martinez, who had been observing the legal proceedings from the periphery, made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Based on what I've witnessed today, I'm recommending that Atlas remain with Mrs. Sullivan under medical supervision. The therapeutic benefit to both parties is undeniable, and separation would constitute medical malpractice at this point." Agent Collins, who had spent years investigating wildlife crimes, understood the unique nature of the situation. "Mrs. Sullivan, we're prepared to work with you on obtaining proper federal permits for Atlas's care, given the extraordinary circumstances of his rescue and the documented benefits of your relationship. The government's interest is in legitimate conservation, not in separating families that have formed through crisis and love." The paperwork took 3 months to complete, during which time Atlas never left Maggie's side. He accompanied her to physical therapy sessions, where his presence motivated her recovery more effectively than any medical intervention. He sat beside her during the legal proceedings that sent Hawthorne and his associates to federal prison. He learned to navigate hospital corridors and waiting rooms with the dignity of a therapy animal who understood his important work. By the time Maggie was discharged from the hospital, Atlas had grown to nearly 80 pounds, but his temperament remained gentle and his bond with her had only deepened through their shared ordeal. The community that had watched their story unfold rallied to support them, raising funds for a proper sanctuary on Maggie's property and establishing the Atlas Foundation to support other human-animal bonds formed through rescue situations. The farmhouse that had been empty and silent for 5 years became a center of activity as volunteers helped build proper facilities for Atlas's care, and researchers came to study the therapeutic relationship that had saved 2 lives. Maggie found herself with a new purpose, not just caring for Atlas, but advocating for the protection of wildlife from trafficking operations and supporting other people who had formed healing relationships with rescued animals. On the first anniversary of Atlas's rescue from the python, the town held a celebration that brought together everyone who had played a role in their story. Atlas, now a magnificent 150-pound American black bear, demonstrated the intelligence and gentleness that had characterized him from the beginning. He performed no tricks, required no commands. He simply existed as himself, a wild animal who had chosen to share his life with a human family. "You know what I learned from all this?" Maggie said to the crowd gathered in her backyard, Atlas resting peacefully at her feet while children from the local elementary school drew pictures of their famous neighbors. "Love doesn't ask permission. It doesn't follow rules or respect boundaries. It just shows up when you need it most, sometimes in forms you never expected." Dorothy Henderson, now bearing the title of honorary grandmother to Atlas, nodded approvingly. "Back in my day, we knew that family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was choice, sometimes it was necessity, and sometimes it was just 2 broken hearts learning to beat in rhythm again." As the sun set over the celebration, Atlas positioned himself beside Maggie's chair in the gesture that had become their evening ritual. His massive head rested against her leg, his breathing deep and content. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: ongoing medical care, legal compliance, the constant work of maintaining a sanctuary that served as both home and symbol of hope. But tonight, as fireflies began to dance in the gathering twilight and the last guests reluctantly headed home, Maggie and Atlas sat together in the peace that came from surviving impossible odds and emerging stronger. The python that had nearly killed him, the trafficking network that had tried to steal him, the medical crisis that had almost claimed her, all of it had led to this moment of perfect contentment. "Thank you," she whispered to Harold's memory, to Tommy's spirit, to whatever force in the universe had brought her and Atlas together when they both needed saving. "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the family you choose is worth fighting the whole world to keep." Atlas made his soft, chittering sound of agreement, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called out, as if celebrating the unbreakable bond between a grieving woman and the bear cub who had taught her how to live again. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. When Maggie Sullivan lost her husband, Harold, and son, Tommy, she thought her story was over. Just another widow counting down lonely days in an empty house. But at 68, she discovered that love doesn't follow our timeline or our expectations. It arrives when we need it most, sometimes in the form of a bear cub who needs saving just as much as we do. Atlas didn't just fill the silence in Maggie's farmhouse. He reminded her that being needed, being chosen, being loved unconditionally doesn't have an expiration date. Their bond proved that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's two broken hearts learning to heal together. In a world that often makes older adults feel invisible or forgotten, Maggie and Atlas showed us that our capacity for deep, transformative love only grows with age and experience. The empty nest doesn't have to stay empty. The quiet house doesn't have to remain silent. Sometimes the very thing that breaks our heart open is what allows the most unexpected love to enter. Your greatest chapter might still be waiting to be written. What unexpected blessing has entered your life when you thought your story was over? Have you ever experienced a bond with an animal that healed something deep inside you? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love found its way back to you.